Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with a little chat about this is sort of a minor issue, let's put it that way. One of the less, like say, important matters in the history of music, but an interesting topic nonetheless in the aesthetics of romantic music, particularly. And that is the question of why so many romantic composers wrote so awkwardly for their own instruments. Because most composers, remember, began life as musicians. Some of them had ambitions to be virtuoso musicians. Some of them were. And they nonetheless became composers who were famous for other things than for what their own instrument was. Most composers were either violinists or pianists, or both. And they managed to write some fairly clunky music for their own specialties, which is kind of, I think, a fascinating thing. Let me tell you what I'm talking about so that we can get away from the theoretical and get into the specific rather quickly. You know, one of the composers who was famous for writing difficult music for instruments besides their own was Bach. Bach was principally a keyboard player, above all an organist and a harpsichord player, one of the greatest of his age. Everybody admits that. But his writing for other instruments could be extremely difficult, and vocal music too. And he was criticized in his day for writing music that was too full of notes and too florid and virtuosic. And he wasn't a romantic composer, but he was a member of a trend or a tendency that later became sort of aesthetic dogma, which was the fact that it was the work itself and its demands, which take precedence over the possibilities of instrumental technique of the day. Bach was an extreme case of this because Bach's music, as you may know, exists in a sort of Empyrean sphere of absolutitude, where it really doesn't matter what he wrote it for, because he treated voices and instruments exactly the same. Everybody simply had to do everything, whether they could or they couldn't, whether it was practical or not practical. He didn't seem to much care. And so some of his instrumental parts are atrociously difficult by the standards of the time and probably wouldn't have been played. They would have been automatically simplified by the performers in question or played partially or adjusted however they wanted. And Bach didn't care because the music was itself. It could be arranged for any forces or ensemble, and he just expected everyone somehow to be able to do it. That was a kind of remarkable aesthetic stance to take for the period. It was an idea that acknowledged the supremacy of the composer and the work rather than the taste and predilections of the audience or the convenience of the performers. And most performers in those days, of course, wrote music only for themselves. You know, virtuosi wrote their own concertos. They were all composers as well because they had their proprietary repertoire. So, you know, Bach is kind of out there as the godfather of this entire tendency. But we're really talking about the Romantic period. And that begins with Beethoven, who was famous for saying, screw your instruments. I'm going to write anything I want. What do I care about your puny violins, etc., etc., etc. He was another one of those. And after him, composers sort of felt that they had license to do what they wanted rather than what the players wanted, or even what the audience might have wanted. There was always that tension. And that tension became more extreme as the Romantic period went on. Wagner, for example, was absolutely famous he invented instruments because he found the instruments of his day to be rather wanting. His harp parts, the 6 harps in Das Rheingold, are famous because the parts are unplayable. Totally, completely unplayable. You just can't do it. What he wrote is you can't. And also in the Magic Fire music, too. Players just simplify the parts. He either didn't know exactly what the harps of the day could do, or he didn't care what the harps of the day would do, and he just expected people to approximate things as well as they could be. But I really want to talk about sort of the basic instruments, piano and violin, because that's what most composers were at and were up to. And there was always this trend in German music particularly to what you might call the anti-virtuoso school, which was very, very difficult to embody in romantic music, because romantic music was flamboyant. It was suited to the virtuoso style, and also it was a period of extraordinary advances in technique and in instrument construction and manufacture to make them more susceptible to the virtuoso treatment. Schumann is an extraordinary example because, as some of you may know, he destroyed his hands, forcing himself to practice to develop a virtuoso technique. And so he lost his career as a piano virtuoso and wrote music which is often extremely difficult, but very torturous as well to play. And it doesn't sound like virtuoso fireworks. I mean, it doesn't sound like Liszt. It doesn't have tons and tons of what you might call mechanical passage work. You know, one of the things that makes his music so difficult is the lack of pattern making in it. You know, most virtuoso flourishes are patterns. And once you get the pattern, it sounds very flashy, but it's not very difficult because it's just a question of mechanical dexterity. You don't have to think. And it's not part of a larger sort of musical argument or progression. What Schumann and his crew wanted to do was always place the emphasis on the musical structure and argument first, and on the technical realization second. So the result is music which is often extraordinarily difficult from a technical point of view, but it doesn't sound it. And that was really a big deal, I would say, in the 19th century. Brahms was one of the ultimate examples of that tendency. Brahms' orchestration, for example, was thick. It was difficult. It was a little awkward. It's hard to do well. It's difficult in a technical sense. It doesn't sound flashy. It doesn't draw attention to itself. And that's true of his piano writing, too. I mean, his two piano concerti, which are among the grandest and most difficult of the Romantic era, do not sound like Tchaikovsky or Liszt or any of those other sort of big virtuoso people who were happy to indulge the soloist penchant for display and who reveled in the opportunity for virtuoso display. Brahms doesn't do that in his concerti. They're quite symphonic. And that was something that became, you know, in certain circles in the 19th century, sort of a goal unto itself. But this idea of sort of anti-virtuoso self-abnegation could also result in a lot of extremely dull music. But there are three composers who I think are kind of fascinating for that reason, for the way that they balanced this tendency to be virtuosos, but also, or virtuosi, if you want to be like, you know, really Italian plural, virtuosi, but also composers who didn't give in to that weakness, if such it was, to be virtuosic for its own sake. One of the most amazing of them was Sibelius. Sibelius was going to have a career as a virtuoso violinist. He was a very, very fine violinist, and he wrote his violin concerto, which is one of the great showpieces of the Romantic violin concerto repertoire. It revels in virtuosity. It truly does, while also sounding like Sibelius. That's what makes it so great. But his orchestral violin parts, oh my God, announce a Sibelius symphony in a community orchestra and watch the violin section run away. They just run away because Sibelius understood that great orchestration depended on woodwinds. And he gave them much of the most important material in his symphonies. The violins particularly do a lot of tremolo accompanying. They just buzz. They're just doing chicka 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 endlessly. And string players hate that stuff. Violinists, of course, think they always deserve the tune. Always. I remember having an argument with a concertmaster in one of my community orchestras. We were doing Rimsky-Korsakov's Christmas Eve Suite. A beautiful, beautiful work, gorgeously orchestrated. I mean, it's Rimsky-Korsakov, right? He wrote the book on romantic orchestration. And this person looked at me very solemnly and said, quite knowledgeably and with complete certainty, that Rimsky-Korsakov did not understand how to write for the violin. And the reason, in his view, was because the violins didn't always get the tune. Other instruments got the tune. And the violin spent a lot of time going ba-da-dum, 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 which drove them crazy. So Sibelius drives his violins crazy because even when the string section gets the tune, as often as not, it goes to the cellos, to the lower strings, to create that delicious dark sonority that we love so much in Sibelius. So why, for a guy who was such a virtuoso violinist who wrote a banging, slamming violin concerto, did he treat the violins so miserably in his orchestral works? Well, he had a characteristic orchestral sound, and that characteristic sound required his violins to do a lot of tremolo, buzzing, and accompanying. And it was the personal quality of his sound that took precedence over the technical possibilities of the instruments themselves, including his own. Another composer who was quite similar in certain respects was Carl Nielsen. Nielsen was even worse than Sibelius, in fact. Nielsen was never a virtuoso solo violinist. He was an orchestral violinist. He spent his life suffering and sawing away as an orchestral violinist, and that always, I think, predisposes composers to diss the violin section or to diss the virtuoso violin tradition because they were stuck doing hack work, in the back desks of some sort of, theater orchestra or provincial orchestra. And it probably drove them a little bit insane. Anyway, Nielsen's symphonies and orchestral works are full of absolutely wretchedly unrewarding passages for the violins. I mean, when they're just going, I mean, just think of the finale of the Fourth Symphony. It's just, the violins are going while a timpani are battling, and the brass are going crazy, and the woodwinds have the tune, or the Fifth Symphony too, the second movement. The opening of the Fifth Symphony, where all the strings are just going yada 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 for like 10 minutes. It's not designed to make friends in the violin section. And Nielsen was, of course, a master at scoring for woodwinds, the instruments he did not play. I mean, even Nielsen's violin concerto. I mean, it's virtuosi hate it, because it becomes less showy as it goes and winds up with a finale that's just relaxed and amiable and oh so pleasant and schmoozy and completely lacking in the kind of fireworks that will bring an audience to its feet at the end of the piece. It's really very, very funny. And he was a violinist. Dvorak, I think, is our last example, is the ultimate in this particular category, because Dvorak was both a violinist, a violist, and a pianist and an organist. I mean, a lot of composers did both. I mean, Mozart played the violin and the piano and everything else. We know that, right? But Dvorak is a rather interesting case in point, because there's a prejudice that attaches to Dvorak's music because it wasn't German. I mean, he's regarded as this sort of naive Czech peasant who had wonderful tunes, but, a sort of ramshackle approach to form, and he was kind of sloppy, and, In the German tradition, when a composer writes clunky and awkward music, as Schumann and Brahms so often did, it's considered noble because it's anti-virtuosic. But when other composers from other countries do it, musicologically speaking, they're considered to be clumsy and sloppy and slipshod, and I mean, it's just bullshit, the whole thing. But that's the way the literature reads, as often as not. And it's really quite surprisingly irritating to see people judge that way. It's just plain nationalistic bias. But Dvorak's violin concerto, which is gorgeous and beautifully written, let's face it, and in no sense anti-virtuosic, it's formally rather interesting, was written for Joachim, the great virtuoso for whom Brahms wrote his rather difficult violin concerto, and Bruch wrote his violin concerto, and Joachim gave Dvorak rafts of suggestions for how to improve it and fix it. Dvorak didn't take them, and Joachim never played it as a result. I mean, the violin concerto, for that reason, was neglected for decades, and violinists should love it. He was a violinist. He knew how to write for the violin, but his orchestral violin parts are often very difficult. He liked to write very high. He liked to write difficult, what they call string crossings, passages that require, bowing across these strings of the violin, which make things a little bit more difficult. I remember when I was in a community orchestra, Johns Hopkins Symphony Orchestra, when I was playing percussion there, and we were thinking of repertoire, we're talking about repertoire, and one of the things that I suggested we do is the Slavonic dances, because they're lovely and everyone does them, and you don't really hear them except as like encore pieces. And I said, let's do one full set of Slavonic dances. And the conductor said, no, they're full of difficult, impossible string crossings. And I'm like, who cares? So let them cross their strings. They can it's what they're supposed to do, right? Apparently, that's very difficult. I mean, in my studies as a very, 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 very amateur viola player, I never got to crossing strings. I never even got to, open strings. So there you go. But Dvorak's string writing is notably difficult in his orchestral works, but so is his piano writing. Oh my goodness, he gets trashed as a keyboard composer. His piano concerto, which Brahms admired, got revised to make it more pianistic, because the actual piano writing is not particularly grateful for keyboard virtuosi. Richter said it was the most difficult work he ever learned. Kind of interesting. But to say that Dvorak did not know how to write for the piano is just the dumbest thing. I mean, he had a career as a church organist. He played the piano all the time. He knew everyone. He knew the most grateful and graceful and virtuosic piano works. Everybody who played the piano knew that stuff. They could have written that way if they wanted to, but he didn't. And as a result, his piano concerto was even more shat upon than his violin concerto. It's only recently been making a comeback in its original version. I mean, for decades it was only played in the revised, Baudelarized piano version by Willem Kurtz, I think was the guy who did it. And, it's not a virtuoso piece. It's just a great piece of music. And so, Dvorak was also, of course, a master at orchestration, and one of the all-time great scorers for woodwind instruments. Yes, because he understood, as did Sibelius and Nielsen, and even Brahms and Schumann. Well, Schumann, no, forget Schumann. But those guys, that really great orchestration and orchestral color was a function of how you handled your woodwinds. The strings didn't matter as much. So I just wanted to sort of bring up this issue as something that you might want to think about when you listen to various composers who we know had careers as instrumentalists, often playing in theater orchestras. I mean, Dvorak played in the Prague Provincial Orchestra as a violist. Sometimes he was the only violist, and had an unbelievable knowledge of theatrical music and the repertoire, and also of string technique. And of course, he never wrote a thing for the viola. Haydn and Mozart both played viola. They both enjoyed playing viola when they had an opportunity, and wrote nothing for the instrument, nothing whatsoever for their own instrument. I mean, it's an interesting phenomenon. And you may, as you read about composers or hear about them and look at program notes, find references to what their instrument really was. And you may notice this sort of disparity between what was supposedly the thing they were trained in and the composers they ultimately became, and the sounds that they cultivated as part of their personal styles. A very, very interesting question in musical aesthetics. So keep on listening, friends. Thank you so much for joining me. Take care.